Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mongolian horse, the unavoidable protagonist of Mongolian warfare and of the great Mongol conquests of the high of the late Middle Ages. The Zhou technique of which is somewhat underappreciated because we will see this horse has very specific characteristics that had rendered him particularly suitable to the same. In fact, Mongol war, had been, of course, selected in part by nature and by men for that specific use, a broad one, because, as we have explained, Mongol culture didn't quite distinguish, as actually most cultures of those time, between a civilian and, let's say, a military dimension. And that also compares interestingly with actually the Western one, the knightly one. It actually was superior individually, but also functional to a different type of warfare that, as we have seen, and we will keep seeing probably tomorrow with a dedicated video, was defeated. In fact, was surpassed by the Mongol one in the moment of the invasion of Europe, at least in open field most of the times. And it's not the entire story, of course. I'll explain you better in a new video, but definitely the point being that the Mongolian horse could afford the Mongol armies, especially that enormous maneuverability in the steppes and, of course, also in other territories. That, however, didn't have to be too far from the latter, because it was the natural pasture land of this animal. To, in fact, move these enormous masses of men, and especially of horses, in fact, across the same. We've seen hundreds of thousands of horses employed in normally just, the grand campaign, let's say, Mongol armies. Talking about, in fact, armies that didn't surpass, it was normal at the time, some, at most, actually a few tens of thousands of men, but that brought together with themselves literally everything, right? So as we'll see now, some say 10 horses, some say even 5, of course less, but some arrive up to 18 horses per warrior, right? And this is typical, of course, of a nomadic society where you move with literally everything you have, and so you bring with you what also fundamentally sustains you, literally in everything, logistically, in terms of supplies, nutrition, as we'll see now from the mare's milk, and more, as, of course, there was cyclicity in the way the horses were used, also for the sake of, say, just the march, very long marches without warfare, and warfare instead. And of course there are important differences between the single animals as well, that were carefully selected also by their owners, that were to decide essentially, of course, with whom to go at war, but from the broader herd, right? So in ways that are different, but literally living with these animals and on these animals all the time, from, say, differently from other, especially sanitary areas of Europe. So and many other things, because the concept of the Mongol warrior is inseparable from that of the Mongol horse, right? Whenever you think about Mongol warfare, you can't really conceive this besides the fact that these people lived literally on horseback, that the Mongol warrior is only a horseman. Of course, he can fight dismounted. There was infantry. There were lots of different troops levied from the subjugated populations that were very often deported, as a matter of fact, as well. So sometimes nomadizing them by a certain degree, considering also the great kind of gray area in between nomadism and what's full nomadism anyway, also by definition, and full sedentarism in the broader Eurasian world. But the Mongols were the ones that literally fit the most that kind of the nomadic um, area, let's say. And a Mongol learned to ride, in fact, as soon as he could walk. Literally, he was tied onto the saddle during infancy and spent his childhood in the company of his mount. There was a special relationship between man and horse, which is necessary in the moment in which you entrust, essentially, this animal, your own life, and vice versa, in combat. Horses are fiercely intelligent animals. They understand the big deals. They participate to the fight. They kick. They bite. They punch each other, the enemy, warriors, and so on. This perhaps we will see better in another video. But the point being that you cannot have good cavalry of any sort if you have a good horse but a so-so horseman, or a so-so horse and a good horseman. And in order to have both of them good, they must have been training together. They must know each other. They must rely on one another. As we will see, this prolonged mounted lifestyle literally meant throughout somebody's life, not just during combat and during the marches. Was functionalized in the Mongolian horse, the fact that it was essentially a very autonomous animal, right? It had, as we will see now, kind of a standard pace of movement. More or less, there was a decisional autonomy in part of this thinking mean of locomotion that was also the main one, to which the Mongol armies were linked in practice. Everything revolved around, again, this enormous masses of horses, to whom is owed much of the success, definitely, of Mongol warfare itself. We're talking properly of a horse, and not a pony, as the modest size of the animal could suggest. In fact, between 13 and 14 palms on average in height at the withers, that is to say between 122 142 centimeters, and while the average weight is around 272 kilos, right? He's small but also rather beefy, but not excessively so in a muscular sense, but as we will see, there is an incredible resilience. And this, let's say, horses were not ridden until they were 3 years of age, by the way, and when they had been broken in some tens of thousands of horses, well, they could be assembled without difficulty. If left united, they never stayed. Also, this was, as we've said, an extremely solid animal, albeit inelegant, if you want. There's not much of an aestheticism about it. Yes, they're good-looking animals, but they're essentially not selected for that, of course, even psychological effect. They have to be functional to a very specific purpose, mechanically speaking. So they have a massive constitution with large and robust hooves that do not require shoeing, and a hard and thick coat capable of making the animal withstand the temperature changes of the steppes. That is from minus 40 degrees in winter to plus 30 Celsius, of course, in summer. Also a long tail and flowing mane, which in mares was trimmed for utilitarian, however, rather than aesthetic purposes. Only stallions had this pretty, in fact, good-looking mane that embodied also in part that kind of aesthetical, psychological purpose. Albeit that was in fact still considered as an elite thing. It was above all the mares or even the foals who were ridden in the countryside and in battle, either because of their calmer nature or because if they were breastfeeding, they could provide the warrior about 2.5 liters of milk in excess of the needs of the foal for an equivalent of 1,500 calories, that is enough to complete a man's diet or to keep him from starving in an emergency. And that's for saying that they literally lived on horseback because they had everything they needed from the horses themselves. Stallions, that, as we've seen, had never their mane cut, on the other hand, had a tendency to be aggressive, or at least more aggressive, of course, towards each other for domination over the females, and worse if they tended to push them away, right, to carry them with them. Well, they could cause in battle imaginable disasters. This is something that you wouldn't expect happening so frequently, but it's literally what affects an important degree of mounted warfare. For example, elephant charges were carried out and were possible to be carried out in the first place just by placing a female in heat in front of the line, and so making the males literally following her. And that's how all the great, elephant charges in history and Punic Wars, etc., the thing was done. Well, for the horses, there is this problem too. The animals, female and male, suitable for war, were, however, highly selected and prepared. Trained, of course. For this reason, every warrior had to be an expert breeder and have a very large herd from which to take the single animals necessary for the campaign, or as we've seen, and or for the specific military task that they had to carry out. And this, of course, is personalized. It's a psychological matter. There are animals that just like people. Some are more aggressive, some are not. Some are capable of smashing into, obstacles and breaking their bones for no reason. Well, you know that you will be using those, for example, to charge straight into the enemy lines, which actually did happen. And it's the entire point of it all, really. So that not all the animals would do the same thing. Some, you can say, horses, for example, tend not to calpest corpses, like laying on the ground. That's kind of interesting, but it's not universal in absolute terms. In any case, always consider that there is a formation, so a space that is not in fact, a basketball field. Even though, of course, in the open steppe, you can do lots of things, and generally speaking, as you know, we have talked very often about steppe warfare. Most, this case, Mongolian cavalry were horse archers, and so they had a much looser formation, and it was normal to break it. There was not much a big deal for about lining up this kind of things. Mongol cavalry, even in the lighter and actually the most consistent, in fact, element, was trained to line up perfectly. Mongols' discipline, silence, coldness, precision, this unisonous kind of movements were part of the entire deal of Mongol warfare. But of course, most engagements took form in different ways. Yesterday we were talking about the Ilkhanate invasion of Syria, and we've seen how the big battle of this, consistent army of perhaps even up to 60,000 horsemen against the Mamluks. So the Mongols actually dismounting, using their horses as a barricade against enemy fire. So that tells you how differently things can really go. But that actually does nothing but increasing the reliability that you need in the horse, and the single horse that that you have seen literally being born and have already tested, let's say, in your time to see whether he can or she can carry out or not certain specific tasks. And this is what the breeder knows in the first place, living literally among the horses. Now, among foals, mares and stallions, a herd of of at least 30 heads, preferably 50, was needed to take those 5 or more that were actually taken to war, right? These were led to gain weight in spring and summer and subjected to intense training in autumn, reducing at the same time the rations to strengthen them and increase their physical resistance. The result was an animal with a strong rump, a solid belly, and capable of enduring enormous efforts. There are some games in Mongolia, Dinadam, that show this performance, of course, in different ways from those times. And, we all have in our countries our own equestrian traditions. But, of course, here we're talking about a hardcore nomadic, semi-nomadic people that was so up to very recent in time. So these are for, especially as anthropologists would teach you with tears in their eyes, some of literally of the last relics of a lifestyle that will be lost in the name, right? Unless we will revert to some forms of nomadism at a point, and don't think that cavalry warfare doesn't exist anymore. We may even make some video about that, but in general, right? And that's much of what we can see. How was it done? We can partly see even today. Before we talk about the saddle, that was definitely an incredibly important part of this relation, of course, between the horseman and the mount, given that it was simply in between them. And the Mongolian one is notoriously a heavy and tall one, right? Built specifically to lift the warrior and allow him to orient his composite bow without limitations, while remaining firmly on the back with the help of 2 front and rear supports. And Mongol saddles were very solid affairs, made from wood, oiled with sheep fat as a protection against the rain. There weren't just horses in the Mongolian herds, of course. This thing against humidity is also the answer to all those geniuses that said, the Mongols couldn't invade Europe because that year we can assess that it was more rainy in Europe, and that rendered the Mongolian bows less effective. Yes, of course. A people that relies intensely on horse archery doesn't know how to keep their bowstrings dry, right? And especially has never seen humidity anywhere, and hasn't designed one of the most important tools of horsemanship exactly to protect itself very effectively, by the way, from humidity, and hasn't successfully, let's say, taken over Russia in winter, and so doesn't know what it means to actually, fight in a humid weather that surely cripples their military capacities, right? These people are the reason why the world goes wrong, and why we shouldn't accept people reason like this. Like, we should create properly a committee to inspire others to simply eliminate these people from society, right? To relegate them somewhere, and letting them disappear into their own nothingness. And there are some very interesting also behavioral qualities of the Mongolian horse. For example, its tendency to decide for him or herself the direction and pace. And this was very important because through it, the Mongolian warrior could count on a thinking mean of locomotion even during fights. I mean, consider what, on average, a Mongolian warrior did on a battlefield. That is to say, running around on his horse and shooting arrows like crazy, right? And so doing lots of very important things at a time. Well, if your vehicle reasons and takes direction for you, well, and knows what the whole thing is about, by the way, because the horse does understand that logic, and you don't have to be in the largest Mongolian armies to know how to do that, because these These men killed each other as a defining essence of their culture. In every single reality, like, raiding warfare is like the normal thing you do against your neighbor, and you know how to settle matters with violence like that. And this happens on horseback most of the times. Well, the horse simply can give you can take care of that side of the story, and letting you concentrate on killing other people and other horses with your bow. That, by the way, is something that requires all that kind of physique, technique, intelligence, skill, practice, experience, and so on, which in fact this entire arms system is designed like, right? Even a light horseman is actually functioning a bit like that, because again, there are two thinking brains there. There is a human and an equine one, and just heavier arms systems such as the heavy cavalrymen that exist with some squire, servants, aides, and so on. It's just a more complex one, but fundamentally still the horse is included and is a protagonist still always of the thing, and also increasing in importance for that matter. So this particular intelligence also had been selected for the needs of a millenary equestrian military culture. And however, given that not all animals behave the same, as nobody really does, those more kind of independent-minded or kind of erroneous horses would be controlled, would be forced to follow the horseman's will just by holding their bridles very tightly, and so forcing the animal just to obey like that, like mostly any other at that point. Now, the main defect of the Mongolian horse, however, was the inability to keep the gallop for a long time. As we will see, this may have some implications, especially from an individual point of view, but it's not really a huge deal in a strategic sense. I mean, the Mongols actually marched much faster and more continuously and effectively so than any other army out there. So of course, cavalry speed has not to do in that sense of kind of how fast can a horse run and for which amount of time just per se. What can work, as we'll see now, is the good enough. The Mongolian horse, however, yes, couldn't keep gallop for a long time because he gets worn out soon. And it's for this reason that the many mounts that were useful in battle were changed extremely quickly. That is to say, they tired relatively quickly, and so the Mongolian warrior could rely on the multiple mounts that he brought with himself on campaign on a regular basis. On the other hand, still about the pace, the Mongolian horse has a natural canter that, as you know, is something between trot and gallop. So something like 40-45 kilometers per hour is a gait useful for rapidly covering great distances, right? Under normal conditions, 60 kilometers per day, right? That can be sustained also for long periods of time. That's where the Mongolian horse is particularly resilient and renowned, as a matter of fact, for its stamina in that sense. One traveler noted at the time that a Mongol on horse could cover 600 miles in 9 days, and a remote system could greatly increase such speed, as you understand. And as we've seen the other day, the Mongolian Empire was kept together not just by the sheer strategical projectional capability, but also, of course, the intelligence that had literally to direct such force. In other words, if the empire had not relied on a very efficient communication system, if news hadn't traveled fast enough and also reliably enough, so with a multiplicity of sources and a centralized system to draw the information from them, the political and strategic process would have simply been a failure. For this reason, it was in the Mongolian Empire that, let's remember, it was the largest contiguous empire in history extensionally, right? And crossing, as you know, an incredible diversity of climatic, properly of environment, some of which are terribly tough, and they have to be crossed, on horseback, right? That essentially kept the Khan in Karakorum in touch with his outlying territories, and bearing testimony through itself to the qualities of the same Mongol horse and of its riders. The elite ones, especially the eyes and ears of the Khan, wore a large, was known as paidza. It was a medallion of either wood, base metal, or silver to show the status and rank of the messenger. And that this was very well praised, especially at the higher level. I mean, silver essentially was the most precious metal after, of course, the gold that embodied the same imperial power. So literally these were the highest race of people below the properly the imperial, the family, or the nobility, whatever was still to emanate from that celestial magnitude. And one example that has survived bears the inscription, quote, on these, in fact, medallion: "The person using the horse must wear the medallion, otherwise he will be detained." And the reason probably being that if this messenger had been seen, and as we have seen, these messages did travel fast, after all, by someone doing something else either than literally running on horseback between the four corners of the empire, well, he would have been demoted. Here it says properly detained, and so punished for not being a fast enough traveler. There was something surely also more ideal about it, of course, considering the fact that these news were carrying with them part of the same Mongol Empire itself. I mean, properly the faculty of command and of power that was so thoroughly based on this. And consider, again, the Mongols, as you know, invaded from Mongolia pretty much most of Eurasia. So they literally knew everything, right? There were many legends and anecdotes, including also, how policed the entire space was. Naturally, reality was much grimmer, let's say, but never underestimate how fast, contrarily to what you've been commonly said, news actually traveled in the world geographically, right? News traveled not so fast when they were not so important. I mean, what did a peasant care about things that were happening, 500 kilometers from him, normally, in a sedentary world, let's say, at least. But a king would have to know literally everything what was happening 500 kilometers from him, and far beyond. And so in the case of the several thousands of kilometers that normally the Mongols had to cross for their yearly campaigns. Well, this information system was vital, as much as the horses that were designed for that, for carrying the messengers. Consider the imperial courier also escorted imperial dignitaries, and the system that supported them was highly sophisticated, as we've seen. There were hundreds of post stations situated every 30 miles or so from each other, and this is interesting because there were other ways, not just horses, to signal, including light and smoke and so on, so that news could travel, at least the essentials, even much faster than that. This is something that we know from Europe as well. Like, it was said that just through smokes and fires, Romans could know in Rome whatever was happening within Italy in a day, right? So, of course, regarding that standardized communication, that the systems that they own refer to. And that was also a complex one. I made a video about that, the Roman signal system that was quite complex. There was a sort of Morse code that they used by comparable complexity to literally deliver entire phrases. Well, that can be done that fast, just visually or acoustically, right, on important distances. Naturally, thanks to these various posts that can't see each other as a net through which the information crosses. Now, a particularly urgent courier in the Mongol Empire would ride with bells attached to him, or would blow a horn, so that when the post station staff heard the sound, they would immediately ensure that fresh horses were waiting, ready saddled, so that literally the guy would dismount from a horse and mount on another instantly and just leave again. And that's how much they cared about the speed of their news traveling. The European, as you know, mendicant traveler John of Piano Carpini was struck by the number of horses the Mongols possessed and wrote, quote, "They have such a number of horses and mares that I do not believe there are as many in all the rest of the world. The horse the Tartars ride on one day, they do not mount again for the next 3 or 4 days. Consequently, they do not mind if they tire them out, seeing they have such a great number of animals." Right, this could increase speed dramatically, as you understand, because the rider is constantly on a horse that thus is much more exerted than the others that just run without no one on them. Yes, they're usually packed or something, but that's not as much as usually as a human being. Well, this depends on naturally whether this armies were loaded in loot or whatever, so things change. There's nothing like an optimal reality, but there is again a good enough average for which they can't strain the single animal, because he will be given at least other 3, 4. This here Plano Carpini says this number, and it fits with the 5 that they usually brought, or even more, as we've seen, because probably there was also kind of a military one that properly didn't have to be strained more than much in the first place or something. As we've seen, John of Plano Carpini is one of those many mendicants that, as you know, traveled thanks to the Pax Mongolica across Eurasia, reaching China. That was plenty of Europeans at the time. We know that there were Franciscan communities there that remained there. Eventually, as you know, the Mongol Empire fragmented, and so the political boundaries increased again, the tolls increased again. So there was a major contraction after the plague that was spread, likely also by this increased mobility that this kind of globalized Mongol Empire had had facilitated in doing so, and so this thing would crumble. Like the Europeans would start to know China once again, just in colonial times, so directly. But in the 13th century, literally, that I made a video about this. The Westerners were very interested in the rest of the world in general, and particularly in China. There was a civilization. The other people in the world weren't so much. So it was something about Western thought there that was already, peculiar in his own regard. And these Franciscans, men of spirit, etc., but as Planos Carpini witnesses, also because they were ambassadors specifically sent by the popes as also as spies, as seeing who these Mongols were, because initially had threatened Europe, and so they had emerged from nowhere. Apparently, the Europeans had to investigate on them, but they had a truly a true strategic culture and education. I mean, John Planos Carpini describes very fine military details of the Mongols, and there are many other. William Ruhrberg, for example. There are lots of other of these mendicants that have an incredible intelligence, of course, and properly farsightedness in political military matters, in technical matters, material ones. They were impressed, in fact, by these Mongol zootechnique and everything revolving around it. And in fact, they're very impressed by what the whole thing entailed. I mean, how the Mongols actually lived. And thus they intelligently observed that at some point it was said to the French king that if not even the French nobility, but the French peasantry had gotten habituated to what even the same Great Khan ate, these are the literal words, those peasants would have taken over the world. And this is by far the best explanation about the moral superiority of the Mongol Empire, because these were a bunch of primitive brutes. I mean, who does live on horseback in their own life? But they managed to take over the world, because also that brutality and that warlikeness used to be spent like that. Eventually, you can't really make an empire standing on something that is not a state. And so, as you know, the Mongol dynasties just ruled in places that already had a civilization. But the impact of the Mongolian conquests is one of the single most important events in human history. And it's exactly that connection with the moral dimension, in spite of this incredible poverty and also kind of disgusting. Like, literally, the message says, if paraphrasing, if even the French peasantry had eaten the shit that the Great Khan did from the Mongol traditional cuisine, and what that entailed as brutal lifestyle, again, they were told in France that those peasants would have conquered the world, and you pretty well know that, peasants in France didn't rule much in the first place. So it's all about moral superiority, right? And so this is a very important message also for today, because of course, as I said, yes, less developed peoples and cultures are definitely not the ones that can make lessons in history of civilization, but comparatively, like if you realize that what you complain about in your own life in a spoiled, fat, rich, and disgustingly so Western world, because even the poor people in the Western world are disgustingly rich, for which they shouldn't feel ashamed, because there's nothing bad in being rich, but they should start feeling ashamed of even complaining if they knew what even just their grandparents were habituated to live like, and wouldn't even complain to the scale that you do, because you're just a whiny bitch and nothing else. And that stems from your deep moral, individual, and cultural inferiority as a person. Right, this is deeply important to understand, and history proves abundantly enough that between your personal opinion and what stays under the soles of somebody's shoes, there is no difference, right? And the sooner you understand this, and the better you can be called a human being worth of this name. So Mongol culture is also this. It's also exactly this ferocious brutality. This hell. The horse is. This is interesting in my opinion, because the same horse is a product of that, right? Also genetically, also behaviorally, also what it can sustain, right? So no, I will not descend into zoological issues, but I think that it's quite fascinating to realize that there is a spiritual dimension, and that we share this with other beings in different ways that the traditional culture is perfectly well aware of in a universal sense, and in that the dichotomy between the divine and the nothingness that degrades in this kind of also, in fact, zoological hierarchy, and it's deeply relevant, and even more so if you consider how important was the horse in the broader traditional pantheon. This is not even about the Mongols, but also in the European one, as you know very well, and in many others that knew the horse for such a long time. Probably we will make a video about the religious meaning of the horse also in the Mongolian world, but not today. Today we stick to kind of more physical stuff. And as we were saying before, various writers support what John of Plano-Carpini said, because the number of horses per man in Mongolia varies from something between 2 and 18. At least we find it in Britain sources, with 5 or 6 being the usual numbers. We said it before, but that tells you like 18 even per person makes it, say, assuming that an army, even a modest army of 1,000 horsemen, makes 18,000 horses. And this poses the problems that we illustrated yesterday logistically, because in spite of the differences, again, with the Western mounts that were superior in warfare, and this fact that at least the Mongol horse could not sustain much of gallop for a medium time, that average, the movements of an army in general are different from whatever the performance of men or horses are, because it's a much bigger system. And in fact, we've seen yesterday that a Mongolian army normally marched much slower than, of course, like any other than a horse can do in a day, or than a person even can do in a day. There are many reasons. Some are purely, let's say, operational. Others are just the fact that these horses were packed in some ways. It's just as the man could be by a certain degree. But there is a major fact here that must take in consideration, is that, of course, the animals were to be fed, and preferably with the natural pasture of the meadows, because even if this breed is pretty rough and not so delicate like, say, the Western one, still it requires that specific type of grass, right? And especially that given quantity that is massive, that is to say, at least 14 kilos of grass per day, which equates also to like 4.5 kilos of hay and barley, and also, and most importantly, about 20 liters of water. You would say, but it's maybe a few. After all, yeah, with armies of hundreds of thousands of horses, do you realize what that even means? Again, yesterday made that video, and you had the Mongol warfare playlist for that matter. And this is true. This is even few for individually, for a delicate European horse. However, they can take up about half a day also just to be consumed as food. The horse was watered once a day, so to save time in the first place, but I think they're used to do that also in the wild. Above all, however, what this problem poses is superficial. That is to say, space, considering about 600 kilos as the average production of grass in 1 hectare of steppe ground, 5 mounts of a warrior could consume it in only 3 weeks, at the rate of about 20 square meters per day for each animal. So, along that average, something like more than 16 square meters, plus something else that was wasted because you walked on it, right? So, as we've seen, the horse was watered once a day, but for most of his time, he had to be eating grass, roaming around a certain area that had to be that one. It could not be used the day after. So this, per se, just as you understand, entails a bit it was just nomadism, but the concept of lordship in a feudal sense, right? You can't have for example, a strong cavalry if you don't have a feudal society of sort, and this entails lording over a larger territory because you have also to feed the animals, and there are people also that live there. So the political system ensues, at least after you have cut enough heads in the process. Now, the main problem, as you understand, arose during the campaigns when the Mongols gathered those herds of hundreds of thousands of animals. They had to be evidently watered exclusively. If you marched along a river that had to be full. So as we've seen yesterday in Syria, for example, that was possible only in winter. And there are just some places where you cannot go. You have to know exactly whether that area there is enough say fertile surface to feed that army for how much time? Like, because an entire district could even support your army just for 2 months. And so you have to accurately calculate all these things before launching a campaign, because otherwise you would find yourself starving or simply dying of thirst even more quickly in a very short amount of time. And this does influence, as you understand, concretely, also the entire operational side and the same strategy at the end of the day, and tactics at some point. A final point is that it's by no means clear whether or not Mongol horses at the time of the conquests were fitted with horseshoes. We have seen it before. Normally, the Mongols wouldn't use them, right? And the main reason being that shoeing for such vast number of horses would have been likely impracticable. Would have produced all that iron just for eventually consuming itself. You have to keep it. No, the thing was not done, right? The sources, in fact, support this view. Descriptions of the Hungarian campaigns suggest that the Mongol horse were not shod. And Rashid al-Din mentions horseshoes as, quote, a special precautionary measure. According to Thomas of Split, the Mongol horses, quote, ran around on rocks and stones without horseshoes, as if they were wild goats. This is quite interesting because if it had been for the Mongols, basically we would have not known much. I don't know whether from Chinese sources we know anything about Mongol horseshoeing, but the obvious is there. These were wild animals. It's not a big deal. It's just like human shoeing. Like, we are designed by nature just to go without shoes, right? In case you didn't notice. So yes, for an average person, it would be extremely painful, to say the least, to just go there walking a while. But after a few time, your thin would become, let's say, thick enough to sustain that. And don't think this didn't happen. We've seen, for example, in Gaelic warfare in our Celtic fringe warfare playlist that this was pretty common up to very recent in time. I mean, even some people during during American Civil War at some point, if you don't have, say, even your uniform after 2 months of campaign during, say, the Napoleonic Wars melts away, literally, from a material point of view. So men obviously, of course, underestimate their own potential. Animals just have also less existential problems, let's put it in this way. And so they don't surely think about what a human invention for them that they wouldn't even be intelligent enough to create, or that they would be enough for themselves naturally to compensate for, would be around or would make a difference. Naturally, from a military point of view, it does, because at some level horseshoeing is, it does affect the type of warfare. Like, you can't, for example, charge effectively without much horseshoeing. Like, for example, in antiquity, of course, cavalry charged like hell, but incomparably more, say, less powerfully than, say, full medieval cavalry. They had the hippo sandals, for example, in Greece, for that matter. They're just a compromise a bit, and this does affect, of course, the grip of the horse and many other things, especially at the collective level. But consider that Mongol warfare wasn't, as we've seen, that much for charging as opposed to skirmishing. Mongol cavalry existed both, of course, in the heavy and in the light form, which is a relative term, but if you compare it even to a Western European knight, yes, the Mongols did have that level armoredness, arguably at some levels even more, but statistically not in a relevant way. But in fact, the steppes cultures have narrower armored elites than, in relative terms, than the other peoples, and so what's the point of horseshoeing for just a horse that doesn't have to perform those dramatic cavalry charges, remaining properly all lined up? They were habituated to jump around sometimes. In fact, also in this tougher terrain, it's interesting that those sources refer to, especially the one of Thomas of Split, because the Mongols did arrive to the Dinaric Alps, to the Alps proper. They didn't cross into Italy, so they surely had observed, like as Thomas of Split says, that even on the mountains, that there was something that they could do. And this is quite interesting, because as wild as the Mongols were for the anecdotes that we told before, so were their horses after all. They had not been spoiled so much by their owners as just in the West or among the Arabs, but they would do. So this is, or in China for that matter. By China was kind of closer to that Mongol warfare from quite a while, and we will keep making also videos about Chinese warfare and so on. However, it's really important to evaluate, of course, the base of Mongol cavalry, zoologically wise, because we don't realize how active, really, from a mental point of view, even before than a psychological, than a physical one, a horse really is in combat, right? They understand everything. They're terrific, and so much in cavalry has that kind of importance, right? So they would just, again, the same comparison I made before. The Western mounts were superior to the Mongol ones in close combat, but at the same time, that's the point. The average Mongol cavalry was horse archers, and so even the horses were kind of more suited to that kind of hit and run thing, as opposed to, in fact, the greater emphasis on the moment type of shock charging tactic training that instead the Westerners had. Not that the Westerners didn't have horses that could do the same, by the way. It would be quite fascinating to think, I don't know, think about the Saracen guards of Frederick II. Well, if they had ever fought against the Mongols, right? Let's assume the Mongols had invaded the Holy Roman Empire. Well, maybe the Mongols would have been very surprised to see horse archers also in the guards of the Holy Roman Emperor. So everything is relative in a way. It's just that the Mongols were dramatically more functionalized in that kind of nomadic military culture for obvious reasons, and thus they had functionalized also their horse breeds accordingly. This video is not really the military unit, historical military unit type. You know, there is a series, a playlist. Very often I say playlist, say videos in multiple playlists at a time, but there is this one especially in which, and I created also one specifically about horses, but this is not going to be, or even maybe I insert it in it, except what I mean is I will make another one that is more descriptive, like in terms of equipment, of gear, appearance, more pictorial if you want, that I will make on another occasion to complete that that series. We will keep talking about Mongol warfare, likely also in the following days. I'm focusing on them again because I have some things going on, and I have lots of pictures about the Mongols that therefore requires me, in order to make the video, just to make a simple research about this and that source, and doesn't take much time, so I'm just making the Mongols all in a row, and who knows, maybe we're going to create a niche of algorithmic views from this series that apparently is liked. At least in the last days, I don't have many views for some reason, because I re-uploaded maybe older videos, so they didn't make much of a they didn't increase the overall flow. But I see that other videos about Mongol warfare very much watched, people like them. And I understand that, because I talk mostly about Western warfare for obvious reasons, and I tend to, let's say, I like actually to have started that series, especially about Chinese warfare and the enemies of China, for which we will talk double time probably about the Mongols, because both as far as Western warfare is concerned and or other, say, the Middle East, etc., and one just for China. And so we'll do lots of stuff about the Mongols sooner or later, hopefully, if I mean time allowing. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.